thought-provoking and indeed prophetic. It's the fourth of four Talmudic readings, also can be found in his 9 Talmudic readings, and it was given as a lecture in 1966 on the subject, Why Does the World Need Jews? Just a very brief biography of Levinas for those of you who are not familiar with him. He was born in 1906 in Kovno, Lithuania, and died in 1995 in France. He had first a secular education and then attended a Jewish gymnasium grammar school, and had philosophical studies in Strasbourg and Freiburg. He joined the French army in the Second World War, but was captured in 1940 and spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp. He studied with some of the great philosophers of the 20th century, including Heidegger, who he later rejected because of his association with the Nazis. And he also had a great influence on subsequent philosophers, including Jacques Derrida, and is generally regarded as one of the great French philosophers of the 20th century. Coming on to this chapter, it's long and I can't do it all justice, but I hope that I'll be able to bring out some of the main points, which I think pose a timely challenge. I won't stop to analyse the Mishnah and Gemara in detail. We'll just concentrate on looking at it through the eyes of Levinas. There may well be parts that are disturbing or confusing. So if you have any questions, do put them in the chat as we go along. Ideally, it would be great to have some discussion, but we might, given the numbers, as previous presenters have done, have to do that through the chat, but we'll see what's possible. But now we'll go to the text, which I will... Right, so hopefully that's visible to everybody. Let me just, yeah. So we start with the Mishnah. The Mishnah, for those of you not familiar with Talmud, is from the 2nd century, and it describes the Sanhedrin, of which a lot more soon. So a Sanhedrin of 23 we're talking about here is arranged like a threshing floor in a semicircle, in order that that's the judges, could see each other. And 2 judges scribes stand before them, one on the right and one on the left, and they write the words in favour of finding guilt and those in favour of acquittal. And it's important to state at this stage that what we're actually talking about is capital cases, trials of those who were accused of a crime for which the death penalty could be decided on. There's a lot to be said about the death penalty as well, and maybe I'll say a little bit more at the end, but we'll get there. Rabbi Yehuda, this is actually Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli in the 2nd century, said there were 3 scribes, in fact, not just 2. One writes the words in favour of finding guilt, and one writes those in favour of acquittal, and the 3rd writes both. And this is what Levinas says about this part. He says, I'll take the Sanhedrin as it's claimed to be in my text, without considering the historic aspect. Perhaps it never existed as it's described here. And in fact, scholars really do doubt that it did. But Levinas continues, for at least 18 centuries, Jewish tradition has considered it the supreme institution of justice. The formation of the Sanhedrin in a semicircle meant that one never saw someone's back, but always their face. And those of you who do know about Levinas will know that seeing the face of the other is central to his philosophy. And we'll have a little bit more about that later, but already here he makes it clear the importance of seeing somebody's face, so that interpersonal relations were never suspended. People saw each other directly. Never was a dialogue interrupted or lost in an impersonal dialectic It was an assembly of faces, not an anonymous society. Interestingly, the translation I looked at talked about it being almost like a stockbrokers meeting. I'm not sure where that came from, so I've just kept it more literal, an anonymous society. But Levinas clearly had in mind something that was really not about recognizing people's humanity. But, he continues, it was an open semicircle, so that when the judges were sitting and discussing the cases under their jurisdiction and giving their sentence, they had to remain open to the outside world. It's not a synagogue. A synagogue could be closed, it could be a group of people who met socially, perhaps, or for prayer, but it's not. It's a court of law. And so, he says, a first response to the question of whether the world needs Jews is, I don't know yet if the world needs Jews, but certainly the Jews need the world. And now we have a bit more Mishnah, which goes into more detail. 3 rows of Torah scholars sit before the judges, and each among them knows their place. And when it's necessary to ordain an additional judge, so if one of the Sanhedrin falls ill or has to leave for some other reason, the court ordains the greatest scholar from the first row. And then 1 Torah scholar from the second row comes to the first row, 1 Torah scholar from the third row comes to the third row, and the court selects another Torah scholar from among the assembled, and they seat him in the third row. But this Torah scholar, who moves from the second row to the third row, would not sit in the first place of the first Torah scholar, but rather in the place appropriate for him. So everybody would kind of shuffle along one place, so that the order of seniority was kept quite strictly. And this is what Levinas says about this. Now something novel, never seen in a court before. In front of the magistrates were the students of the law. And here, of course, he means what we might call yeshiva students, to use a kind of modern analogy, students of Jewish law, study of law and justice, and theory and practice, rigor and mercy, all the polarizations belong in Judaism to the duality of the house of study and the law court. So the law, in a sense, isn't just about the strict application of the law. It's much wider than that, as is clear from the Talmud, which doesn't just set down the law. Even the Mishnah doesn't just set down the law. It has more to it than that. And then he goes on to say, why were there 3 rows of 23 scholars if the case could result in the death penalty? It could not be decided by a majority of 1. So if they voted and there were 12 in favour and 11 against finding guilt, students would gradually be added, and they'd go on with this voting until it reached a maximum of 71 in an attempt to reach a majority of more than 1. If it reached the maximum and there was no such majority, the accused would be acquitted, because a person could not be condemned to death on a majority of 1. So this is very important, and it's one of many provisos which in this chapter of Sanhedrin make it clear that it would have been very hard in practice to impose the death penalty. So as an aside, but an important aside, I think, although provision was made for the death penalty, because the Torah makes provision for the death penalty, so the rabbis of the Mishnah couldn't say this isn't something that's possible, but their feeling was very clear that they didn't ever want the death penalty to be imposed, and this was one of their ways of making sure it wasn't, by hedging it about with so many provisions. each person moved up a place, and then Levinas continues, and he says everyone knew his place, and it was an absolute order. So they've got, let's see, got oh, Jeffrey, yes. How does Levinas derive from what he's written about Mishnah that Jews need the world? I think it's just from the shape of the semicircle. So you can imagine the judges sitting, seeing each other, but also it's not a circle where they would be seeing each other, but not the world. It's open. If any of Levinas scholars know more than that, please do chip in. But that's how I understand it. Any other questions at this stage? Okay, so I'll move on. Now we come to the Gemara. The Gemara is the discussion on the Mishnah, and it's generally much longer. We've got two Gemaras, in fact. We've got the Babylonian and the Palestinian. This is written in Babylon. I say written, it was gradually developed, partly orally, over 5 or more centuries after the Mishnah. But one of the things it does is try to work out where the Mishnah gets its rulings from. It tries to root the rulings of the Mishnah in scripture. And so that's what we get here. From which scriptural verses are these matters derived? And Rabbi Acha bar Hanina says, as the verse states, your navel is like a round goblet. Let no mingled wine be wanting. Your belly is like a heap of wheat set about with lilies. And you might be saying at the stage, what? What is going on here? Where's the Talmud getting all this from? What's it wanting to do? And that's exactly what Levinas is now going to answer. So to the question, how does one know this? A strange answer will be given. The Sanhedrin, with its magnificent semicircle making human faces visible to each other, with a perfect hierarchy attesting to an order which is objective and subjective, finds its origin in an erotic poem in a verse from the Song of Songs. The verse which the Gemara chooses can leave no doubt about the subject. In my understanding, this is the essential point of my reading of the Talmud. Let us delight in this paradox. One can understand that an erotic text can deepen with mystical meaning, but we are in the presence of something stranger, an erotic text founding a court and a system of justice. And he goes on to comment on the next bit of Talmud, which says, your navel, from Song of Songs. This is an allusion to the Sanhedrin. And why is it called your navel? It is because it sits in the navel of the world, in the temple. And again, Levinas explains a little more about this. He says, it will be the obvious that the navel represents the Sanhedrin because the Sanhedrin is cited in the navel of the world. That's not necessarily self-evident, but we'll see more. In this way, the absolutely central character of justice is confirmed, which the Sanhedrin, by definition, offers the justice of the Torah. But then he talks about how a friend reminded me, he says, that the image of the navel of the world is Greek, and that the Eumenides or fates of Aeschylus, which I have to say I'm not familiar with and had to look up, but Delphi is designated as the navel of the world because it's there apparently that there was an argument and the fates threatened terrible revenge, and Zeus came down and said, no, we're just going to have a proper court of law so that we can judge things instead of killing each other. So Levinas picks up this and he says, is Judaism necessary to the world? Can one not make do with Aeschylus, with this story of the founding of justice? Delphi is called the navel of the world because the pure and just gods reside there, who know how to interpret the will of Zeus, a god who, in this tragedy, is extremely decent. As we know, Zeus very often was not extremely decent. And he says the text of the Fates is at least 5 centuries older than the Mishnah, but it's 3 centuries younger than the prophets of the Bible, and that's my first consolation. And then he says, what then is the difference between Delphi and Jerusalem? And this is where Levinas really gets on to what distinguishes Judaism. He says, let's distrust easy antitheses and rhetoric. We are justice, they are charity. He's in the nuances, the modulations of voice, as strange as it might seem, that gulfs open up separating the messages. And he picks up again on the Gemara, which talks about a goblet, agan in Hebrew, which teaches that the Sanhedrin protects Miginah, the entire world, with its merit, which is of course a very big claim. Around Hasahar, this teaches that the Sanhedrin is similar to the moon, and the court sits in a semicircle. So again to Levinas, the Hebrew word used for cup is called agan, and the Talmudist is going to analyze this world. He reads its megin, which means to protect. He confirms that the navel signifies the Sanhedrin. Is it not true, which as I've said, seems a very big claim, that the Sanhedrin protects the whole world? A doubtful etymology, but certainly it talks about the universal significance of the court, that it protects the universe. I won't necessarily read all of Levinas because time's short, so I probably will cut some of it a little bit short. But the role of Judaism, of which the Sanhedrin is the centre, is a universal role, a priesthood at the service of the whole of being. So as I said, it's a big claim, and we'll see how he develops it. We'll leave the next part, although it is also important to note that the rabbis had professions. I loved Gabriel's title of his session because a reminder that rabbis could also be blacksmiths and innkeepers and so on, and they had to have time to be absent from the Sanhedrin to tend to their profession. So let's come to this. Your belly is like a heap of wheat, a very strange phrase by any account, even within the Song of Songs. But just as with regard to a heap of wheat, all derive benefit from it, so too with regard to the Sanhedrin, all derive benefit from their explanations of Torah. Set about with roses, and Shoshanim here it can be translated as roses or lilies, but Levinas chooses to translate it as roses, and partly because he then goes on to mention thorns. But I'm intrigued about it because a hedge of roses with its thorns is very different from a hedge or a fence of lilies, which of course is much softer. So I think it's worth bearing them both in mind. Anyway, he goes on to say that one can legitimately, according to Western principles of exegesis, wonder whether the analogy between the beloved and the Sanhedrin is perfect and convincing. No matter how characteristic it is for the Jewish spirit, even popularly, this assimilation of motives, culminating in an allusion to substantial food, and appropriate on Shavuot to notice that the Torah is frequently compared to food, to sustenance, kemach, imein kemach en Torah. If there's no substance, there's no Torah as well. And then he comes to the fence of roses. What do the commentators say? They say these members of the Sanhedrin who hold in their hands the fate of the universe. What do they do with their own faults, their own vices? Are they not exposed to all the same temptations as the men they are called to judge? No, says Levinas. To be a judge in Israel, you must be an exceptional man. And of course, the rabbinic judges were men. We can't get around that, but we can think differently in our times. Even when sin is only separated from you by a hedge of roses, you must not make any breach. They must completely overcome their instincts. That the man who judges men must be better than them is a demand for which there are no half measures. It's a utopian demand. There can be no justice if the judges have no virtue in the completely moral sense of the term. There cannot be a separation between the private and the public life of the judge. It is in the most intimate aspects of his private life, in the secret garden, and this goes back partly, we'll come to it here actually, we'll see more about this private life, the secret garden, or hell of his soul, Levinas interjects, that his universal life blossoms or changes. And here we have, again, this reference to the most intimate, this most private life in the Gemara. A certain heretic said to Rav Kahana, you say it's permitted for a menstruating woman to seclude herself with a man. This is the nida in Torah terms. Is it possible to set fire to chips of kindling and not have them come alight? And again, a typical Talmudic reflection on male desire. But Rav Kahana said the Torah testifies concerning us that we are set about with lilies or roses, and the Jewish people do not breach even a hedge made of roses or lilies. So Levinas says this about it. What is new is considerable. What was just said about the judges is now said about the whole Jewish people. Judaism does not affirm by this any national or racial pride. It teaches what, in its opinion, is possible for human beings. And I think this is quite important because obviously the whole question of, do Jews think themselves better is tricky. And I think what Levinas is saying, that it teaches what is the ideal, and this is perhaps an idealistic passage rather than reflecting the reality. But he's saying morality starts with us and not in institutions, which cannot always protect us. It demands that human honour can exist without hiding. The Jew is perhaps the one who, because of the inhuman history it has experienced, understands the superhuman demands of morality, the necessity of finding in oneself the source of moral certainty. They know that it is only separated by its own disgrace by a hedge of roses, and they're always aware of the thorns underneath the roses. It's necessary to find in oneself the certainty that this is a real obstacle. And he goes on to say one can read the text differently, many lessons. Of course, that's the multivocality, the fact that there are many voices and many interpretations in the Talmud. But what stops us is not the unbearable yoke of the law, which frightened Paul, but a hedge of roses. The obligation to keep the commandments is not a curse. It brings the first sense of paradise. And a bit more Talmud. Your temples are like a pomegranate split open. Even the empty people, a pun here again, rakatech rekanim, not a very good pun, not the best rabbinic pun perhaps, but still, even the most empty Jews are full of mitzvot, as the pomegranate is full of seeds. And Levinas says, Reish Lakish gives an answer that you must have been asking whilst you listened to the praise of these men who are protected from temptation by a hedge of roses. How do they make it a reality? So step by step, I think Levinas is leading us on a path. And here he adds one more step. by the method of mitzvot. And the originality of Judaism consists in constraining oneself through the smallest practical actions, a way of interposing between us and nature in fulfilling a mitzvah. And here I think the questions for us as progressive Jews about what the mitzvot mean to us and how these mitzvot can constrain us. It's not, I'm sure we would say, about keeping all the minutiae of all, well, not 613, because a lot relates to temple, of course, but all the mitzvot of the Orthodox people might keep. But what do we mean by the mitzvot constraining us? And I think that's a question that I wish we had more time to talk about, and perhaps we'll find time at other times to talk about. But for there to be justice, again, there have to be judges who can resist temptation, and there has to be a collectivity who practice the mitzvot. He says the simple fact of our race is not a guarantee against wrongdoing, and the Talmud has seen and said that better than anyone, with nearly unbearable force. The Jew without mitzvot is a threat to the world. In the Talmud in Beitzah, it's taught that the Torah was given to the most obstinate people, and that if it had not been given, or the Jewish people lost it, no people in the world could resist. An anti-Semitic vision in the Talmud, that is remarkable. Jew as an invader against the defenseless people. And of course here, as throughout, there are resonances, and I think this is why I thought this text was so alive, and we'll see more. So the privilege of Israel is not in its race, but its mitzvot which train it, and the effect of the mitzvot depend on their practice, certainly, but as I have said, not indefinitely. So another curious passage in the Talmud. I'll stop there. I think if anybody has got any questions meanwhile, because that's an awful lot of text, an awful lot of Talmud, and a lot of Levinas. So if anybody's got any questions before I come to the last part. Okay, I'll carry on. So we get a very strange, another strange Talmudic passage, which is Rabbi Zera said that this whole I've lost my thread. That we derive this importance of the mitzvot, I think he's saying, is from a verse in Genesis where it said where Isaac says that Isaac smelled the smell of Jacob's garments. Remember, Jacob had dressed up as Esau, so he smelled Jacob's garments and smelled Esau, but he said, see, the smell of my son is the smell of the field that the Lord has blessed. And then he says, don't read his garments, bagadav, but bogadav. Actually, a better pun here, bagad and bagad have the same, you can see in the Hebrew, the same Hebrew three-letter root. But Levinas says, Jacob is carrying with him all those who after him will rebel against the law. I think, however, that the theme of disguise here is essential, and the answer of Rav Zera opens up for us a new perspective on the excellence of Israel as the excellence of humanity able to keep faults, vices and temptations. And here really he comes to the crux. How can he keep himself from wrongdoing? By taking on the responsibility for others. Human beings are not only in their ultimate essence for oneself, but for others. And this for others must be realized with alacrity. Nothing is more strange to me than the other. Nothing is more intimate to me than myself. Israel teaches that the ultimate intimacy for myself consists of being at the same time responsibility for others, the hostage of others. And these are Levinas's italics. I can be responsible for what I have never committed and assume a distress which is not mine. So we have a typically Talmudic story here to follow about hooligans living in the neighborhood of Rabbi Zera, and he brought them close so they would turn in responsive. He goes on to explain about Rabbi Zera, but we haven't really got time to go into that, so I'll skip that and come to his conclusion. The human being who is hostage to all others is a necessity for human beings, because without that, morality would have nowhere to start. The little generosity that is in the world requires no less. Judaism has taught its exposure to persecution can only lead to the accomplishment of this teaching, a mysterious accomplishment because it is without the knowledge of those who accomplish it. And we have again about the rows of the Sanhedrin, and we have a conclusion when it says all have their place. We've understood from the beginning, when one finds oneself in the rows of students and goes up to take a place among the judges, the first place is left empty and everyone moves up a place. And one is reminded of the one who in the row above was at the tail, that it is better to be at the tail of lions than at the head of foxes. This is quoting the Talmud. Human beings take their place in the world by the relationship to the absolute place, by their relation to Makom, the eternal God. So that's how Levinas concludes this chapter, that ultimately we have to find our place in the world by relationship to God. I think that was a lot of text to take in. I've made a really kind of bulletproof summary, which doesn't do justice, but is my understanding of what Levinas does say as the unique contribution of Jews to the world. That we must be able to see the face of each other, that judgment must be open to the world, judges have to be beyond reproach, all Jews have to be beyond reproach. And the way we achieve that is by way of the mitzvot, which train them to resist wrongdoing. Jews take on the responsibility for each other, and each person takes on the responsibility for each other, and each person has their own place in relation to God. We have about 5 minutes for questions and discussion. It's late at night, and I suppose I think those questions of responsibility and how far we are responsible for each other really jumped out at me. Thanks, Robin. I think especially how you as somebody who with a legal judgment as well, background as well. That's really important, isn't it? That image of that semicircle Sanhedrin. Yeah, as I say, I think responsibility and how far our responsibility extends. Oh, thanks, Claire, for your quotation from Levinas. In the face, a right is there. Yeah, I think he doesn't say that explicitly here, but I think that idea is very present throughout. points 6 and 7. So I think, and I'm not sure Levinas says this, but Levinas does emphasize the fact that Jews will take on the responsibility for each other. But I think he's also saying that Jews have a universal responsibility. They're not just responsible for Jews. I think I extended a little bit to everybody else, but that perhaps went a little bit beyond Levinas. But certainly, that Levinas would say that Jews are not just responsible for Jews. Yeah, I think some. Thank you, Gabriel. Is I think absolutely, yeah. Um, yeah, Claire, I'm not sure. I read that, but it's possible it's possible that I read that in where when it wasn't there. There's a difference between your love your neighbor and love your stranger. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Warren. Um, yeah, it's interesting about Buber, and I think Judith Rosenberry, who's presenting later, could say much more about that. But I think um, Levinas and differed from Buber in some of how they saw reciprocity and how and the I doubt thou and the face how they sort of seeing the face of others. So yeah, I think I wish I knew more. Thank you. Well, should we end there? I think
Yes, Margaret, I just want to thank you very much. Because I think the thing is, certain things people think, well, that's closed Talmud or indeed Levinas as a philosopher, but actually you've helped us to read the text and actually to see those conclusions. And what speaks very powerfully to me is the semicircle as that openness, but also both Jews taking responsibility for each other and each person, that as Jews we are also human beings, and I think Levinas draws that out, and you've drawn that out for us. So thank you very much indeed.
thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you, Margaret. We're now going to take another break. We've got about 5.5 minutes, and then at 11:25, Rabbi Jeffrey Newman will be taking us through the Hasidic story of Hanoch of Alexander. Thank you.